Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I don't know, good day. Hello, everyone. Hey, Jason.
Hey, Ksenia. All right.
All right, welcome back to Disaster Deconstructed live stream. Today, we're hosting this live stream in collaboration with Disaster Prevention and Management Journal, our favorite journal. And this is the journal that has kindly published our special issue on disrupting the status quo. And we will tell you more about it in just a second. As you probably know, I'm Ksenia Chmutina, and this is I don't know, I never know which side you're on. This is Jason von Medden. And in today's webinar, we're joined by a fantastic group of our friends, colleagues, and comrades. So I'm sure the next hour is going to be pretty amazing. Well, for those of you who've been following our podcast and been following our live stream, you probably already realized that we're not particularly happy with the current status quo of disaster scholarship and practice because it is very much grounded in capitalist ideas. So instead of reducing disaster risk and kind of addressing the root causes of vulnerability, many pursue business as usual, i.e. growth and profit, and thus recreating and creating new disaster risks as inequality is deepening. And this is because what is motivated, and this is kind of what motivated us to run the conference in Florida 2 years ago and then publish the special issue, which our live stream is based on today.
Yeah. So in the context of the massive global challenges that are caused by rapid human development, a group of us, some of whom are here today, gathered in Gainesville in 2019 in June to discuss some of the most pressing but underrepresented, misunderstood and divisive topics in our field. And we collectively asserted that status quo practices, policies, and solutions are not getting us where we need to go. And as a consequence of this sort of limited vision, we're missing opportunities for potential transformative change during disaster recovery and reconstruction. And so the special issue that we published as a result of this conference in Gainesville makes the case that disaster risk creation has become the norm within our current political, economic, and societal systems. And the authors present a lot of compelling visions of how we might disrupt the status quo and embed their arguments in nuanced understanding of global productive system and capitalist societies. And so they bring attention to the underrepresented, the marginalized, and the oppressed, who are always disproportionately affected by disasters. And our special issue in Disaster Prevention and Management Journal comprised 9 papers, and we're so pleased today to have the authors of 5 of the papers here with us: Lisa Bornstein, Heidi Michalski, Wes Cheek, Vicente Sandoval, and Johannes Waldmüller.
And also joining us today are 2 of our wonderful co-editors and conference co-hosts, Giuseppe Forino and Emmanuel Raju. Hey guys, hi. You may recognize them from season 1. We talked about the conference in season 1 when 4 of us gathered in Jason's office in Florida. When we were allowed to gather in people's offices. That was amazing. And we talked about the conference. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks to you. Thanks.
Just some quick introductions to remind our audience of who you are, if they don't recognize you yet. So Giuseppe Forino is a human geographer and a senior research associate at the University of East Anglia. His research on disaster risk management and climate change adaptation has been focusing on Italy, Australia, Vietnam, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Ecuador. And Emmanuel Raju is director of Copenhagen Center for Disaster Research. He's an associate professor at the University of Copenhagen and co-editor of Disaster Prevention and Management Journal. And Emmanuel's research interests include disaster risk reduction, disaster recovery, and governance. So again, thank you both for co-hosting IRAC 2019 with us and, for working with us to get the special issue out. Well, now we will move on to the papers. So in the next half an hour or so, we will invite the 5 authors of the papers that featured in our special issue to reflect on different questions that we posed to them based on their publications that kind of address how status quo needs to be challenged, and what are the problems and how we move forward with challenging the disaster status quo. And then we will have time for questions and answers. So if you do have questions, please post them here or post them on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or wherever it is you're watching. Jason and I will be compiling the questions, and we will try to pose as many of questions as we can to our guests and also to Giuseppe and Emmanuel. You can't escape that easily without answering any questions. So, let's go. Over to you, Jason.
Okay. Thanks, Ksenia, and thanks, Giuseppe and Emmanuel. I'm going to start with by introducing our first author from the special issue, and we'll see all of you guys a little bit later. Okay, so first I want to start off by introducing Johannes Waldmüller, who is a research associate professor of political science and international studies at the Universidad de las Americas, Quito, specializing in political ecology, global ethics, and disaster politics. Johannes's research broadly focuses on human development, structural vulnerabilities, intercultural ethics, politics, and international cooperation in the context of post-disaster reconstruction, and the long-standing political nexus between development and disasters. Welcome, Johannes.
Yeah, good morning. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
We hear you fine.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, hear you well. So, Johannes, the invisibilization of ethnic minorities is a worldwide problem, including Ecuador. It occurs.
Hello, can you hear me?
Maybe we should come back to Johannes. We're going to have to work on the fly here, Emmanuel. Why don't you move on to the next speaker, and I'll come back to Johannes.
Sure. Thanks, Jason. It's our pleasure to introduce to you Lisa Bornstein, who's an associate professor at the School of Urban Planning at McGill University. And her research examines the decision-making processes in the politics of voice and influence around them with respect to urban and development policies. She employs comparative analyses with work in North America, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, with attention to inclusion of those often marginalized. Thank you so much for joining us, Lisa, and good to see you again.
Yes.
Welcome.
I think the last time we saw each other was at the conference, the climate change conference.
Exactly.
Great.
At COP. It's been more than a year now. So good to see you again. Thanks, Lisa. Lisa, your paper with others, We Said, They Said, The Politics of Conceptual Frameworks and Disasters and Climate Change in Colombia and Latin America, which is also co-authored with colleagues from Colombia and Canada. It reveals that academic frameworks are often disconnected from local reality and can be used in an instrumental way to inform the urban policy agenda in a way that supports inequalities and injustice. Now, how do academic languages and narratives inhibit local needs, and how does that contribute to risk creation?
Okay, so paying attention to language is in and of itself sometimes difficult, because languages can be important to how we frame and understand issues, but also people's own understanding of social dynamics, their own self-image. So we're dealing with multiple levels, from the individual up to collective policies, programs, and the actions that follow from them. The context of our research was that we were undertaking a 3-year longitudinal study of adaptation and resilience to climate change. And we were doing it in partnership with colleagues in Colombia and with specific community organizations and residents in 3 different parts of the country, Yumbo, Salgar, and San Andreas. And the kinds of questions that we were asking was, how are vulnerable residents in informal settlements in these 3 areas adapting to climate change and their effects? How do bottom-up grassroots, local actions and interventions contribute to disaster risk reduction. So we thought we were being very, very innovative and importantly, talking to people about the things that they did in their understanding around climate change, around their own vulnerability living in informal settlements, and about the adaptations and actions that they were taking. But over the 3 years of the research, we found that our questions required translation constantly to explain them to the ordinary people with whom we were working. And they were not the terms that residents used. So we began to look at the language and the discourse and began to analyze narratives that came directly from local people. And in the paper, we refer them to those narratives as vernacular and juxtapose them to the sort of techno-academic narrative that development professionals and academics and disaster specialists use. And just some examples of the kind of incommensurability in terminology. We went and looked and wanted to talk to people about their capacity to adapt. And the language they used was, no, people have an attitude. People with the right attitude can weather the hazards and storms that they encounter. We would talk about informality or informal settlements, but that's not how people describe their own lives and their own living situations. They saw them as communities in the process of aspirational development, or not even those words, just in construction, not outside of society, but part and parcel of it, not in contrast to something that was formal, just ordinary life. Our focus was on climate change effects. Theirs were on the hazards and difficulties of daily life. How do we get water? How do we get jobs? How do we deal with the dust that comes from our unpaved streets? So we might say, well, so what? You know, they have different language. They describe things in different ways. We just translate. That's what academics do. That's what we're good at. We abstract and come up with concepts and terms so that we can analyze and compare and critique. What's so bad about that? Well, what we found is that it actually was quite pernicious, was contributing to something that we label maladaptation, where the very measures that were supposed to be signs of improvement and lessening of inequality were instead deepening inequality and deepening risk. So some specific examples of how that might work might be that it distorts reality on the ground. So it may introduce in local communities problems or concerns as a target for action that don't really exist. It can distort, discount, or make invisible messages that are voiced by local communities and citizens. It can help produce or justify solutions that don't address the needs and expectations of local residents. It can perpetuate in academics and policy a body of knowledge that just doesn't capture the reality that we're trying to get at. It can fundamentally increase the gap between academic work and the problems people face. So it distorts, but it also distracts and fundamentally depoliticizes. It aspects of daily life that people are highlighting that are required for social change. So our concern is that the very actions and measures that we were looking for that would be ones that were transformative were instead being sidelined by our terminology, our narratives. And we concluded that really part of it was a fight for social justice. And we had to include that as part of our focus and recognize that that was people's main concern.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks for that.
Hello. Thank you, Lisa, for answering to Emmanuel question. I would like now to introduce Vicente Sandoval. Vicente currently works as a visiting postdoc researcher at the Disaster Research Unit at the Free University of Berlin. Vicente has a PhD in development planning from the Bartlett Development Planning Unit at the University College London. And he has 10 years of experience in disaster research. Vicente served also as a consultant and researcher for different organizations such as USAID, GIS, European Commission, among the others. And his recent research interests are on urban disaster risk governance, evidence-based approach, urban street network analysis, and development studies. So welcome, Vicente.
Thanks so much. It's very nice to see you, Giuseppe.
Nice to see you again since a long time. So you have published this paper that is titled "Assessing Disaster Capitalism in Post-Disaster Processes in Chile: Neoliberal Reforms and the Role of Corporate Class," and you have co-authored with colleagues from Chile and the US. The paper demonstrates how, after a disaster, neoliberal reforms can occur and provide direct and indirect benefits to the corporate class in Chile, in your country. So I would kindly ask you to explain how these mechanisms work and how these mechanisms are related to disaster risk creation. Thank you.
Thanks, Giuseppe. Yeah, it was a difficult starting point. Primarily, we are talking about disaster capitalism, a framework that was a starting point, and we, after looking for different conceptualizations of the concept of disaster capitalism and empirical examples, we arrived to a departing point. That was disaster capitalism is an approach adopted mainly by the corporate class and government to directly profit from disasters and to introduce neoliberal reform. And at that point, we make those distinctions. The first is our reforms that can be, on the one hand, tend to amplify the risk prior the occurrence of a disaster, but on the other hand, also reforms that are opportunistically introduced after them. So in other words, we acknowledge that disaster capitalism is not only present after disaster, but that they can be situated before. So in the entire cycle of disaster risk management, so to say, is the whole process. So in the paper, we look at two events: the volcano eruption in Chaitén in 2008 and the Maule earthquake in 2010. The 2010 disaster is the most useful to answer the question because it's basically its magnitude. This was a 8.8 magnitude earthquake that triggered the area of Copquecura in central Chile, triggered the destruction of about 500,000 housing units, including public and private infrastructure, and obviously also the saddest part was the loss of life of 525 people. And the total economic loss was calculated in $30 billion USA dollars, which at that time was about 20% of the national GDP. So we found that the amount of the reconstruction was huge for a country. It's huge for the amount. For the situation of the country, the effort was huge. So we found that in a country, one of the findings was that in a country highly neoliberal like Chile, was little space to advance or to deepen neoliberalism further. So because most, I'm meaning with neoliberal reforms, for instance, because most of these neoliberal reforms already took place in the 70s and 80s. I'm talking about the almost full privatization of education, health, pension, and housing. Also the privatization of water, deregulation or the dismantling of all the environmental or most of the environmental protection. So disaster capitalism took the form of profiting, most of it, in the case of Chile, and also was the opportunity in specifically in urban areas to finish long social conflicts over the space by relocating vulnerable people from high-value land to the periphery of cities. This occurs more in the south. So the main point here is that the status quo of the country, that the neoliberal one, was completely somehow ignored or untouched by the disaster. Maybe we assert that this was not deepened. There are not more neoliberal reforms, but was not openly contested, neither directly, despite the reconstruction was highly unjust for the poor. In other words, the system, in our opinion, the system react by recreating the previous unjust distribution of risk. Basically, we have the same. And to give you an example, the number of people living in precarious conditions and unsafe conditions that we call in Chile campamentos, which is our informal settlements, is 10 times higher than it was in 2010. And most are related to immigration, but also to pass a situation with the 2010 earthquake as well, and the level of destruction of people that was displaced by the earthquake. Just to say that, to mention an example, but that basically I can add.
That's great. Thanks, Vicente. Hopefully now we are going to be able to go back to Johannes. Johannes, let me see if I can get you on here. Hi, Johannes, are you here with us?
Hello,
Great.
Yeah.
Great. So I did your introduction. Hopefully you were able to hear your introduction earlier. Everybody else heard it, I believe. So we want to come back and talk about your paper. So you were talking about how the invisibilization of ethnic minorities is such a worldwide problem, including in Ecuador, where your study was cited. So it occurs through practices such as clandestine and illegal activities, securitization programs, and large-scale modernization attempts, as well as ecological disruption. And this is, you called it a permanent disaster. And in your paper, Invisibilization through Decolonial Delinking, Disrupting the Permanently Neglected Disaster at the Border of Colombia and Ecuador, you argue for a decolonial lens in politics and practice. So how can decolonization challenge and dismantle the status quo?
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for your introduction. Sorry for problems with the connection. And thank you very much also for this organization and invitation. I would like to start by just saying a word of warning also, no? I mean, decolonial thought and practice is now very much high up on the agendas. It gained much more track recently in the context of Black Lives Matters movements, anti-Trumpism, COVID-19 in general. For example, the LSE in London recently inaugurated a decoloniality hub. And also development studies are suddenly full on trying to decolonize. But yet there's a risk, no, of deploying the term and related practices in a sense of mere identity and symbolic politics without any real substantial transformation in terms of knowledge, actors, etc. And that there's a risk of getting readily absorbed by the apologists of what I would call business as usual. So despite that, disaster research, disaster work is, I think, really in a dire need still of talking about decolonial engagement, and it fits very well to the current context that we're living in this pandemic, which in fact is a syndemic, which is a aggregation of several concurrent or sequential epidemics or disease clusters at the same time linked to, for example, poverty, stress, structural violence, epistemic violence, and so on. And I think this brings us right into the topic. Arguably, as we know now, most if not all disasters affect predominantly the poor, the vulnerable, and particularly in the global south, where do exist, in fact, very diverse and diverging cultural and social narratives about disaster, about recovery, well-being, or trauma, or even the word resilience. No, there are different significances attributed to these concepts. And I think what is really needed, and I try to present this a bit in my paper, arguing about the concrete case I will talk about in a minute, is that we should revisit disaster studies and disaster management and even humanitarian action at large as a key to planetary management in the context of climate change, which at the same time tends to obscure very much the underlying social and political causes of global crisis. So in this sense, we have to not only talk about and address in the field the actors of what used to be called natural disasters, no, and we should not call it anymore like that, but also the social, political, and economic processes which lead to vulnerability, exposure, and risk. And here in Andean Latin America, unfortunately, there is still a predominant technocratic, militaristic, and US-centric approach to the 4 stages of traditional disaster management, mitigation, prevention, response, recovery. But what is left unexplored or even invisibilized is an in-depth, long-term ethnographic and sociological approach to studying the processes, very much linked to ethnicity, social class, and the experience of living a chronic or ordinary disaster of the excluded, the voiceless, the subalterns, or what I call in my paper the permanently neglected disaster at the border between Ecuador and Colombia. Now, in the context of COVID-19, for example, we know that it predominantly affects Black lives and those living in cramped, substandard living conditions at the margin of huge cities, as well as those who can't afford not going to the streets on a daily basis for making their living and in the absence of any social security system. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a tremendous task still to be done of disentangling disaster management from normative politics, which have in fact caused several forms of epistemic violence to the responses. As you said in your question, there are many responses to disasters that are biased in terms of modernization theories, or doing reconstruction under urbanization perspectives, or trying to control territories through militarization, securitarization in the name of sustainable development, etc. I think all this leads us to the need for a change and applied transformative and even emancipatory practice in the field, including a foster transdisciplinary engagement and turning attention to identity categories where there has been little consideration of disaster narratives and imaginative depictions more broadly. What I do in my article is talking about the Afro-descendants in Ecuador, Colombia, many times in many ways linked through kinship relations. This is one of the most notoriously dangerous and literally neglected areas in the world, except for drug trafficking and human trafficking, and probably environmental disasters of all sorts linked to predatory exploitation and military attempts to control the area. But that's just one way of talking about this. So what I try to present is a delinked version of telling the story of the region, not pointing to the extreme poverty or disaster that people experience all day long through what I just mentioned, but also pointing to global economic contexts, the overfishing that took place that destroyed the local forms of autonomous survival, the illicit economies of money laundering which are taking place in the area and beyond. We could even go deeper and find centuries of resistance against the central state and its hegemonic cultural, economic, and social narratives of modernity. For example, in Ecuador, the Afro-descendants have never been slaves, but offsprings of those who escaped a shipwrecked slave ship. So all these are somehow, quote unquote, accessory parts and parcels of a specific place. But typically what happened is that this never appears in the disaster management plans, in the recovery plans, and not even in the promotion material for collecting donations for humanitarian actions. So I think we could really shift, I suggest in my article that we could change and shift the way we talk about the cases of those who are affected of the disasters, pointing to global dimensions and importance of certain local cases. And in this way, the decolonial perspective, what it really does is not only just, diagnosing the negative impact of Western culture or elicit mere whining and blaming of others' tribulations. No, it's an invitation. It's an invitation of an option towards empowerment, emancipation, most importantly, healing and restoration. This includes, of course, the removal of shackles and legacies of hierarchical, racialized thinking and practices, but there's more to it. It is about a vital transformation towards humanizing disaster studies, understanding human environmental relations in a different way, and to be really explicit about the political links between vulnerability production, environmental exploitation, and post-disaster reconstruction. In this sense, what the decolonial approach can bring forward is going beyond the typical idea of problem or solving problems, and rather address issues as compound processes that demand the attention to systemic factors, colonial histories, and creative responses, and very much so in terms of collective trauma, connecting to social psychology, connecting to community health, much more than just talking about what I really don't like much, using this term, reconstruction. Yeah. I think this is mostly what we can talk about.
Yeah, no, you touched on so many points that are incredibly relevant today, and we look forward to further conversation with you, Johannes. Thank you. Okay, so next I want to introduce Heidi Michalski. Hi, Heidi. Heidi is an environmental lawyer and is completing a PhD at the Federal University of Santa Catarina in Brazil. Her research area is ecological law and human rights. She's a member of the United Nations Harmony with Nature Knowledge Network and associate of the Brazilian Law for a Green Planet Institute. Thanks so much for being with us, Heidi.
Thank you, Jason. It's great to be here. I'm very honored to be part of this podcast with such amazing researchers. Well,
Heidi, maybe I can pose a question before you begin. So in your paper, Social Environmental Injustices Against Indigenous Peoples, the Belamonte Dam, co-author with Jose Ruben Morato, you state that the construction of Belamonte is characteristic of hydroelectric expansion in the Amazon, criminalizing social movements and weakening social and individual rights. So maybe you could explain to us how large infrastructure projects in Brazil impact local communities, and in particular indigenous groups, and why social movements are so central to resisting disaster risk creation.
Well, thank you, Jason. To begin with, it's important that we understand that indigenous and tribal peoples around the world, they have an extremely close relationship to the environment, and the land is fundamental to their livelihoods, their economies, but also they have a very deep and profound spiritual relationship to the natural world. And to better talk about how indigenous and local communities are affected by those mega projects that I've mentioned in my paper, I brought some data that I'd like to share with you. According to the Amazonian Georeferenced Socio-Environmental Information Network, 68% of indigenous lands and protected natural areas in the Amazon region are under oppression from roads, mining, oiling, dams, oil drilling, forest fires, and deforestation. And although illegal mining is present in all the Amazonian countries, the greatest environmental destruction comes from official projects which are supported by federal and regional governments. To support that, between 2000 and 2015, almost 40,000 square miles of the Amazon forest was cut down within indigenous and protected areas. More than 84,000 miles of roads have been built by governments in the Amazon region up to 2018, and of which 16,000 miles are located in indigenous or protected areas. And those roads, it's important to mention that they have a key role in the increase of deforestation in the Amazon region in Brazil. There's also cartographic data that indicates that of the 272 large hydroelectric dams, either in operation or under construction or planned for the Amazon region, 78 are within indigenous territories. That's a lot. Indigenous people, unfortunately, all over the world, but especially here in Brazil, they are regarded as backwards or primitive. And I believe this is often used by the state or by multinational corporations or by whoever to justify taking over their lands in the name of a so-called development. And this kind of threat is particular increasing here in Brazil under this current government of our president, Jair Bolsonaro. And when we talk about the relationship between the social movements and disaster risk reduction, it's important to acknowledge that indigenous and local communities, they organize themselves as collective actors, and they join multiple processes of collective action as a way to build power and influence decision makers, as a way to transform cultural codes, and also to work with their own hands on their resilience and development. And these social movements are a real strength in terms of people's resilience and development. And resilience, which is not related only to preservation, but mostly to transformation of the economic model, of the political system, of the dominant cultural codes, which I believe is disruptive. The social movement's perspective implies changing the way that international organizations deal with their programming. They should start from the organizations and processes of collective actions, which people and local communities are involved in, and these constitute an existing political dynamic to build on during the years. And this is unfortunately frequently ignored and or opposed by the government, by the state, and by multinationals. And thank you very much for your question.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Fascinating. I really enjoyed your paper, and I'm sure the audience has questions for you and for other speakers. And indeed, if you do have questions, please post them on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, or just here in the restream if you're watching us live, and we will post the questions in just 5 minutes. And finally, I would like to introduce our friend, our convert, Dr. Wes Cheek. Hey, Wes. Wes is a disaster sociologist, or as some of us know him, a disaster socialist, and is currently a Japan Society for the Promotion of Science postdoctoral fellow at Ritsumeikan University Institute of Disaster Mitigation for Urban Cultural Heritage in Kyoto, Japan. Wes has been conducting research in the Tohoku area of the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami since March of 2011. Hey, Wes. So I've got a difficult question for you. In your paper, The Paradox of Community Involvement, Rebuilding Minami Sanriku, you reveal how the reconstruction after the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami did not always leave space for local communities to be part of the recovery process and, to have their voices in decision making. And in this way, a top-down and centered decision approach is common to many countries, not just Japan, I suppose. So how can we challenge this persistent status quo in top-down politics after a disaster? You're on, Wes. Can you hear me?
Hello. So I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
I can kind of hear you guys.
Yeah.
Anyway, great. Yes, I can hear you. So very good question. A lot going on there. First off, happy Mardi Gras, everybody who's in a place that's fortunate enough to celebrate Carnival, which is ending today. And I bring that up. You're saying, how is this going to work into the actual question? And I'll get there. But happy Mardi Gras. And if you are someone who is from or lived in New Orleans for a while, like me, it's a very strange Mardi Gras this year, not just because I'm not in the country, but because all the parades are canceled that we usually have all during the weeks leading up and all today. And the interesting thing about that is all the parades are canceled, but you can't actually cancel Mardi Gras because it is a community event. It is something that happens in many different ways in homes across New Orleans and Louisiana, right? It happens throughout communities. It happens in all sorts of ways that we can't even see, right? So it's not something that you can really stop. So beginning with that, I want to talk about community, right? And so how that factors into this. And that tension we can see in Mardi Gras, because even though it is something that can't be canceled, even with all the restrictions, it is also something that is kind of being encouraged to happen by outside actors, or sort of outside actors, like the Tourist Promotion Council, who is saying, please, everybody, come to New Orleans during the middle of a pandemic, right? So if we examine that tension, and I think that's a tension that takes place around the world across lots and lots of these kind of events, then we can understand what was going on in Minami Sanriku as well, which is there is this disconnect between community, which is, we all know, a very complicated, problematic, contested word, the way that happens in real life and the way it's perceived from the outside and acted on from the outside, right? So in Minami Sanriku, which is a small fishing village of around 10,000 or so people in northern Japan, I was looking at the rebuilding process after the 2011 Great Japan earthquake and tsunami that happened, right? And so all of the national and international documents were saying, we are going to do community-based reconstruction. This is all going to be community-based. But it never really stopped to ask, like, what is the community? How are we based in that community? And is there any issue with all of us being national and international actors coming in from the outside and saying, we're going to do this as a community? So what I was looking at here, and what I kind of put in my conclusion, is that there is a real disconnect between this ambition and the rhetoric of saying we're doing a community-based approach, and having that be run through actors for the national government, the prefectural government, even the city government, and then hiring teams of consultants to come in and say, hello, we are here to do community-based reconstruction, right? And so, as I was talking about with my brief Mardi Gras example, right? The community is a thing that happens outside of the actions of elite actors, right? It's not, by its kind of nature and definition, it can't work that way. So one thing that you can't do is come in after the fact of a large scale disaster and say, okay, we're going to do community involvement now. We're going to define the community, we're going to decide what it is, and we're going to decide how it works. A community is something that exists outside of that, and it exists before a disaster. And if you're not engaged with working in that community before a disaster, it's impossible to come in afterwards and just create it for the purpose of post-disaster reconstruction. So my kind of conclusions for this were that I think the effort in Minami Sanriku was a good faith effort to come in and try to involve the community in the reconstruction process. But the problem is there's only so far a community can be involved in that, right? Because the financing, the plans, all of these things are done outside of the community. And so what a community is really asked to do is make some large cosmetic decisions about are able to cut in there and change some funded things, but that's hard to do and doesn't happen all the time. And that a lot of the problems that you run into are that without a working definition of community, you're kind of lost. And without a robust plan to engage with, you're just kind of walking around in the dark, sticking your hands out, saying, where is this? And importantly, without a willingness to concede authority, power, and leadership to that community, you're really just acting on them, not acting with them. So those are the lessons from Minami Sanriku that I saw that I think are applicable to us worldwide. And if you kind of reverse those problems, you're starting to see ways to disrupt the status quo, which is what we were looking at. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Wes. I think you're bringing a really important point, and that we kind of use the concept of community, the term community here, there, everywhere, without actually understanding what it means. But perhaps we'll come back to this in a second. And if we can have everyone on the screen magically, I don't know how Jason does it, by pushing some magic buttons. So there we go. We're all here. Thank you all so much for these amazing contributions. a lot to think about. And we've been discussing, of course, your papers as they were published in the special issue, and I think there is a lot to unpack and discuss. And thank you for these great interventions. And I want to start with a question, and I'm using my privilege as a host here to just kind of barge in with my question. And I've got a question to all of you. So if you were to choose one thing that you think we should be challenging in disaster scholarship and in disaster practice so that we can actually decrease the risk of disasters, what would that be for you? And I will invite our guest editors to contribute to this as well, so we can hear their opinion. Does anyone want to start?
Yeah, okay, I'll start. Very difficult question. I think, I don't know if I have a right answer. The thing that I would like to say is that for sure, the disaster scholarship needs to be more self-critical. I think this is something going on in the last years. So self-critical about the concepts we use, the way we engage with people, the way our mindset is set to reflect about some of the topics. So doesn't mean that all we have done in the past is wrong, but for sure there is need to self-reflect on what we have done in the past and to address in the future, contextualizing what we do in the context of the society, of the global and social system that causes the disasters. I think that this is very, very important, and this is something that in the last years, not just in terms of research, but also in terms of practice, has been addressed. But we have a very, very long way to do. But we should never lose our capacity to, first of all, criticize ourselves as scholars, as professionals, and as scientists and social, physical, and interdisciplinary scientists. I think that this is the first thing to do. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Giuseppe. Indeed, cannot really argue with that. Lisa, perhaps I can ask you next. We can't hear you, I'm afraid.
Sorry.
Oh, yes, we can hear you now. Yay!
Okay. Hard to go to one, in part because accepting complexity is one of the challenges that we need to confront, and looking for technocratic, easy answers is counterproductive. So just some very, very quick responses. One is recognizing the politics, that there are winners and losers in what we're doing, and that going back to technocratic, easy solutions doesn't work. Treating people with respect. So I think humanizing our practice, allowing different levels of analysis to come in is really important. And I think, again, we're seeing this in our world right now, just how we can't siloize and isolate one aspect under study or under attention in a reconstruction project or in a disaster risk reduction approach from wider social dynamics or wider environmental dynamics. And so, again, reductionist, easy, technocratic approaches aren't enough, and we do have to be more self-critical and aware as we move forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. Emmanuel, what do you think? And then Johannes will come to you.
Right. Very interesting. I mean, I think I fully agree with what Lisa and Giuseppe have said. It's very hard to sort of pinpoint one or two ways of doing this. But I think, let me begin with saying that, yes, we fully need to be self-critical of where we are and where we are going, particularly with the kind of work that we do. I think there's a number of, for example, when we talk about the manifesto that some of us were part of 2 years ago, and in terms of challenging the status quo, I think that was a great beginning, and I would really like to see that being pushed forward much more. One simple way of also looking at, for example, the way how do we look at ethics when we do disaster research? Not just the bureaucratic ways of saying I have an ethics approval from the university, but what does this mean for our respondents, for communities? How are they co-designing this entire process of data? And I think it was a very interesting blog by Professor Thea Hillhorst that she wrote on exactly this this relationship between data research data, and sort of how do we engage with these communities, with the communities that we actually work in. I think we need to really be aware of these lost in translation kind of issues as well, because then we fundamentally lose out on many important aspects, such as the politics of local politics, for example, which is fundamental to disaster research that Lisa just spoke about.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Indeed, and well, we talk a lot about the kind of code of practice, right? And the languages that we use and abuse, not just in terms of translation, but in terms of the meaning that we imply. Thank you. Johannes, over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you. I really agree with all that you said so far, the ethics, the self-critical awareness, turning into larger social processes. That's absolutely key. I would just like to expand a bit more on a point that Lisa mentioned, but she didn't talk much more about it, which is the environment. I think there's really a need to deepen engagement interdisciplinarily, transdisciplinarily, and even in practice with ecology, political ecology, geography, all sorts of disciplines that work on the creation and the transformation of territory as a fundament of social society, of society as such, and social processes. And I think this is really fundamental. If we look, for example, at again the COVID-19 crisis, which is linked to the deforestation, right, to the intrusion of humans into natural habitats and the increased contact with all sorts of animals that didn't have to be much contact with humans before that. There's so much that need to be looked at in this respect, because it is really able to prevent future problems. However, there is a lot of resistance also in the practice that I would like to mention, and it is a sort of resistance that we really have to address also as disaster intellectuals or managers or disaster workers. For example, I'm based here in Quito in Ecuador. We are having every 20 to 25 years, we have strong earthquakes, very similar to Chile. However, we have a construction sector in the country who is openly opposing the compliance with new construction rules that would prevent, including huge houses here in Quito, from collapsing. So this is a resistance. That is a resistance that is absolutely unreasonable. We cannot understand it, but we have to address it. We have to find ways where we link probably the environment and the way we talk about environment and society in different ways, creating incentives, different sorts of incentives to overcome these sorts of these forms of resistance.
Thanks,
Thank
Johannes.
you. Thanks so much.
I want to pose a question to Heidi, because Johannes, you talked about kind of our relationship with the environment, and I just wonder if you have thoughts, Heidi, about what we need to learn from indigenous peoples in terms of the interrelation with the environment. And so it's a very different relationship than Western culture has with the environment, right? So maybe you could speak to this a little bit.
Thanks, Jason, for your question. I believe indigenous communities, they have many different cultures and those cultures, they show different aspects depending on those communities live. Especially indigenous women, they have traditional knowledge important to transmit to inside their communities and outside their communities. they see the nature and the environment as a mother provider, as a spiritual entity. So their relationship with nature is not of domination, but of equality. They see themselves as a part of the environment, as a part of nature. Even the exploitation of the natural resources is made with care, is made with consciousness. So there's much we can learn with indigenous communities and culture and the cosmovision, especially here in Latin America. But in fact, I believe that first we need to invite those communities, invite local people and indigenous people to be part of the decision making and policy making. I believe that once we do that, we will probably have better answers for many problems like climate change, like disaster risk reduction, and so forth.
Thanks so much, Heidi.
Emmanuel?
Yes, thanks, Ksenia. Thanks, Jason and Heidi, for that. I just want to follow up with Lisa on what she sort of introduced in previously, and I think in the paper, Lisa, you sort of you and your colleagues talk slightly about the resilience framework and the two important tensions. And maybe could you expand on that slightly in one or two examples of why that's important?
Well, I'm not sure which tensions now you were referring to, but I'll give some examples of some of the incommensurability of different ideas, right, and the ways in which sort of the techno-academic narratives don't match up with what vernacular language is. And the vernacular language points to really important dynamics. So, for example, the sidelining of social justice and depoliticization of disaster studies and disaster understanding of what's going on. Local residents pointed to mining companies that contributed to deforestation. And in their view, that deforestation was as much a cause of flooding, erosion, and landslides as any intensification of storms and weather patterns associated with climate change. Likewise, in San Andreas, an island off the coast of Colombia, development approaches adopted since the 1950s that intensified tourism and industrial activities as economic pathways forward attracted new residents and visitors who use water more intensively. So local people look at these non-Indigenous practices, corrupt politicians, mismanagement, non-prioritization of their water needs, and their local long historical practices around water management as major factors in current crises. Again, as much as any sea level rise and associated saltwater intrusion. So they're putting very, very clearly a longer history of justice, of exclusion, of inequality. And they're also resisting strongly shifting of responsibility around you have to build your capacity to adapt. And their point is, why should we take on responsibility for dealing with problems that have been societally created? These are government, these are mining practices, these are things that are societal problems and have been constructed that way. Government and other actors now almost have to engage in a politics of restitution in which the inequalities are addressed and people who've been most vulnerable are now promoted and protected and engaged with.
Right, so true. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you so much. Well, our time is up, and I think we could have talked for another hour. This is fascinating. So thank you all again so much for your time and for your contributions to the conference and to the special issue, and generally to disaster scholarship. I'm sure many of us enjoy reading your contributions, and I'm sure the audience enjoyed listening to you today. Again, we would like to thank Disaster Prevention and Management Journal for supporting the special issue. And if you haven't seen the special issue yet, please check out the DPM website, and we will also tweet about it once again. I'm sure the authors will be happy to share papers. If there are any paywalls, just drop us an email. We're always happy to do so. And please keep an eye on the other 2 exciting special issues that are coming out in Disaster Prevention and Management Journal. One is indeed on the manifesto that Emmanuel has mentioned earlier today, and we will also have a live stream on manifesto in a couple of months' time. And another special issue will be specifically dedicated for the early career scholars in disaster studies who have been mentored, and they are going to present some fantastic insights into what's happening in disaster scholarship now. So thank you again for joining us. As always, you can find Disaster Deconstructed Podcast on any podcast app, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.